McGilchrist. He's a psychiatrist and author of The Master and His Emissary, The Divided Brain and the Making of the Western World. Almost 500 pages on the various implications of the differences between the two hemispheres in the brain, much of which you want to dispute. Let's put that on the record right here. Many popular misconceptions about those differences.
Yes.
Let's start there. Like what?
Well, for example, one of the misconceptions is that it's about thinking versus feeling, that the left hemisphere thinks and the right hemisphere feels, or that it's about visual imagery in the right hemisphere and language in the left. But in fact, language and visual imagery are subserved by both hemispheres, and both of them are crucially involved in imagination. It's not just one or the other. And it's not true that the left hemisphere is this little hard-nosed thing that's down to earth. It's actually not very down to earth at all. In fact, in some senses, the right hemisphere is more in touch with reality.
Well, if this isn't then so much as a debate about what the two hemispheres do, but rather how the two hemispheres do what they do, what are the differences in the left and the right at the end of the day?
Well, I mean, perhaps it would be worth mentioning that they have obvious, observable structural differences, that they're different sizes, weights, shapes, different, if you look at the surface of the brain, different convolutions, the gyri on the surface of the brain are different. They have different architecture to the cells, they respond differently to neurotransmitters, so they're obviously different, and they're divided in this way. And I started to look at what the differences were in birds and animals, because they also have divided brains. And it turns out that this has to do with attention. I think importantly, attention sounds... cognitive scientists often talk as though attention is just another function. But actually it grounds our reality. Things only come into being for us when we attend to them, and how we attend to them changes what it is we find. So it's not just that things out there dictate to us a certain kind of attention that's appropriate to them, that's correct, but also the kind of attention we pay changes what we find when we look there. And in birds and animals, there's a Darwinian explanation for why they have to do two things at once and keep them separate. Can I give you an illustration?
Well, I'm guessing this is eating and trying not to get killed at the same time?
This is it.
Okay.
Correct. But I mean, if you think about, the easiest example is to think of a bird trying to pick out a seed against a background of grit. It's got to focus clearly on something that it's already prioritized and knows it wants, and it goes for it and gets it. And, but at the same time, if it's going to stay alive, it's got to have a completely uncommitted, open attention for anything that might exist, including obviously predators. And there's a very good body of knowledge about birds and animals showing that they quite reliably use their left hemisphere, their right eye in most of these creatures, to focus on these detailed things that they want to manipulate, and their right hemisphere, their left eye, to look out for the broader picture.
Okay. The title of your book is about the relationship between the right and the left hemispheres, the master and his emissary. Which is which?
Well, again, contrary to what people imagine, the master is not the left hemisphere. The master is actually the right hemisphere that is silent. It doesn't have control of speech, but it sees more of the picture and understands more than its emissary, the left hemisphere, that it needs to keep a certain distance from. It needs that left hemisphere to go and do important work on its behalf, and it mustn't get involved in that work. The difficulty is, because this emissary, very bright, very efficient at doing what it does, thinks it knows everything, it doesn't understand what it is that it doesn't know what it is that it doesn't know.
Without the other hemisphere to put it all into context.
Exactly.
And
so there is a progression in all things. The right hemisphere grounds our first experience of something. Then there's an intermediate phase of processing in the left hemisphere. As things become familiar, they get categorized, they get abstracted, they get systematized. But then there is this very important third phase of the return of that information to the right hemisphere, which is able to put it into a global context. And the problem comes that sometimes this process stops with the left hemisphere. And increasingly, I think, our reliance on knowledge that makes us powerful, that comes from being able to dissect the world, makes us think that the left hemisphere knows everything when it clearly doesn't.
But are all the things that we prize, not all the things, is much of what we prize about contemporary Western society based in that left hemisphere?
I mean, everything that we do, of course, is dependent on our whole brain, and I don't want people to run away with the idea that we don't use one part of our brain. Of course we do all the time for everything. But the two hemispheres have styles, takes, if you like, on the world. They see things differently, they prioritize different things, they have different values. and they construct a different version of the world. And what I would say about the modern world is it tends to reflect excessively the products of the left hemisphere's processing of reality, and tends to drive out by marginalizing, undercutting, or pretending that the concepts that the right hemisphere is familiar with just don't exist, because they don't have any meaning to this emissary.
Want to give us a for instance on that?
Well, I think it misunderstands the nature of our embodied existence. It tends to force things into either or, black and white, mind or matter. I think it tends to misunderstand things, everything, which is in fact implicit, intuitive, and these are often some of the most valuable things in any civilization. We know that, broadly speaking, when we communicate, the mass of what we communicate is not actually in the words themselves, that it's in a lot of other things, in the tone of voice, in humor, in irony, in metaphor, in imagination, that needs a contribution from the right hemisphere. And the left hemisphere makes things very literalistic, very explicit, and reduces our ability to see things in a skilled, embodied way to algorithms and procedures.
Do we pay a price for being too left hemisphere centered? If that's
well, I consider we pay a very high price.
What's the price?
We may pay the ultimate price because I think it prioritizes the need to have more material resource. It treats the world as a simple resource to be exploited. Its raison d'etre, if you like, is to manipulate. It doesn't really understand the whole picture, it doesn't need to, but it just manipulates well. The right hemisphere sees the whole picture. And if we get too focused on manipulating, what we construct is a world that's very mechanical. We start to see people like machines, and we start to see machines as we attribute attributes that are human to them, which they don't have. And I think this process is extremely damaging. It's causing us to think that we're acting rationally towards certain goals, and then we're surprised when, paradoxically, those goals are not achieved. For example, we pursue happiness, and actually happiness is something that can only come as a byproduct. Actually, most of the great things in life can only come as byproducts. They can't be pursued in the way the left hemisphere thinks it should do. The left hemisphere is the great grasper. It controls the right hand with which we grasp things, and it controls the bits of language, not all of language, but the bits of language with which we pin things down and say we've grasped them.
But you'd like us to be a little more right hemispherically focused, if you like.
It's important to have balance. And sometimes people say to me, well, what would the world be like if the right hemisphere ruled the day? And the answer is extremely balanced, because the right hemisphere knows what it needs, the contribution it needs from the left hemisphere. The master actually sent its emissary on purpose to do certain work. The emissary starts to think that it knows everything and knows better than the master. That is the problem. And so we get locked into a system in which we think we know everything, and we just get to know more about what we already know. We don't branch out. We cut off all the bits that would have given us a hint that there's something else.
And you said that a number of mental illnesses can be attributed to the imbalances between the right and the left hemispheres. Which illnesses might you be referring to there?
Well, this is controversial stuff, and I don't expect everyone entirely to agree with me. But there are some illnesses, including Asperger's and autism, and anorexia nervosa, which are both characteristically modern conditions, which the evidence suggests are largely dependent on loss of functions which in the normal brain are underwritten in the right hemisphere. So they're like right hemisphere deficiency states, and they seem to be getting commoner. There are arguments about whether they really are or whether we're more aware of them and so forth, and we don't want to go into that whole debate now. But even setting that aside, they probably are on the increase. And schizophrenia, which is associated with, we think it probably only started in the Industrial Revolution, and seems to be more associated with urban cultures, may be another example.
And how do those imbalances which result in those things happen in the first place?
Well, they happen, I think, because we start to see the world in certain ways. People of influence in the culture begin to generate a way of looking at the world that then filters down in a sort of, until it becomes an intuitive way of understanding amongst the people at large. And then this way of thinking generates a world out there. We interact with the world all the time, and as Norman Doidge has pointed out brilliantly, our brains are plastic. They change in response to the environment, but we also create an environment in response to our brain. So the brain and the environment are in dialogue. We start creating a world out there that looks very much like the left hemisphere's world. then we will start to favor these illnesses. People who have these characteristics, they will be reinforced rather than discouraged. And they may actually be better suited to taking positions of influence in a culture, and they may rise to power, and they themselves perpetuate this way of thinking. It's a subtle process.
You gave an example of a study of Mexican immigrants whose mental health actually worsened the more years they spent in the United States?
Correct.
Explain that to us, because of course the conventional wisdom would be they're away from their problems, they've come to the land of milk and honey, they ought to be better.
That's absolutely right, and it just shows how difficult it is for people to understand that actually material affluence is not the cause of well-being and in a mental sense. In fact, one of my very distinguished professor colleagues, when I reported the data, but there's no doubt about these data that show that people are less happy now than they used to be marginally, although they were very much less well off materially than they are now. He just said, well, it can't be right because they've got televisions and washing machines. But actually, this is not what makes us happy. It turns out that it has very little indeed to do with material well-being. Once your basic needs are covered, the rest is just icing on the cake, and it may actually make things worse. What matters is social interconnectedness, social cohesiveness, trust, and the sense of belonging, having a place where you belong and with other people. And that, of course, social cohesion is gradually being eroded, and I think that, along with the mechanization of our attitudes to human beings, is causing people to feel an emptiness, to feel frustration, and to become anxious that things are out of control, they need to somehow control them, and it gives rise to a lot of anxiety and a lot of depression.
I don't mean this to sound as flippant as I fear it may sound, but are you saying modern, complex, Western societies are bad for our mental health?
I think I'm saying exactly that.
Okay. Then it wasn't as flippant as I feared it would sound.
No, pretty much on target.